Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the All-Inclusive podcast with Jay Ruderman.
Hi, I'm Jay Ruderman. All-Inclusive is a podcast focused on inclusion and social justice. Join me as I interview leaders and experts on the latest news focused on advocacy for social justice. In order to make progress that will lead to a more equitable future, honest discussions must be held. That is what All-Inclusive is all about. Listen and subscribe to the All-Inclusive podcast on Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, and anywhere else podcasts are available. Visit the show website for more information and full episode transcripts at www.allinclusivepodcast.com.
This is Judaism Unbound, episode 278. The Deli is my synagogue. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rothberg.
And today we're taking a break from our series of episodes exploring Judaism and the trans experience to interview the author of a new book. We're really excited to have this conversation, but before we jump into it, since it's the beginning of June when we're releasing this episode, and some of you might know that nonprofit organizations generally have a fiscal year that ends on June 30th, this is an important time for us to put out an appeal for some financial support from our listeners. And I should note that when I say nonprofit organization, I really mean it. Nobody in the Judaism Unbound and Jewish Live enterprise is making a profit. In fact, we're not really making very much at all. And not that any of us expects to get rich doing this, but we really would like to build a stable, sustainable organization in which everybody who works in this enterprise is paid a decent wage, and where we're able to expand our offerings and do more and more so that we can connect you with the really exciting thinkers and doers out there in the Jewish world so that we can continue to develop new workshops and classes and all kinds of things that we dream of doing. In the last year, during the COVID pandemic, over 100,000 people accessed some of the material that we've created on audio or video through Judaism Unbound or Jewish Live. It's an incredible number. And I want to share with you that in this same last year where 100,000 people accessed our material, we have had fewer than 500 donors. We've talked on this show about the idea that it would be great if everybody only donated a small amount, like $1 for every hour of content that you've consumed. We would love it if you're able to do that. But if you're not able to do that, or this isn't a great time, the truth is that any amount that you could donate would be both appreciated and helpful. Because if we can show other donors, foundations and other large donors, that we have 100,000 people using our content, and some meaningful percentage of that audience is so interested in what we're doing that they want to help it continue, even if they can only afford a small amount, that would indicate a level of engagement with what we're doing that would get other donors really excited, and that would translate into the larger amounts that we need to actually keep all of this running. I would love it if everybody who is listening to this right now might just pause the audio for a second, go to www.judaismunbound.com/donate, and donate something. Even if it's $1 or $5 total, we're super appreciative. It would help a lot. Even if everybody just gave $1, it would make a huge difference to go from 500 donors to 1,000 donors. So please consider pausing the audio right now, heading to www.judaismunbound.com/donate, and making a small or large donation. We really appreciate it. So with that said, let's turn to our interview for today. Our guest today is a returning guest, Rachel Gross. She is an assistant professor and the John and Marcia Goldman Chair in American Jewish Studies at San Francisco State University. She has just come out with a new book called Beyond the Synagogue, Jewish Nostalgia as Religious Practice, in which she argues, as we'll discuss in this interview, that doing the kinds of things that many of us do that are kind of visiting a Jewish museum or Jewish building or eating Jewish foods, that we're often taught to think about these things as cultural Jewish things to do, but she argues that we should understand them as religious activities. One thing that we'll note, we're going to get to this topic in a few weeks, but the Pew study of Jewish Americans came out recently, and she wrote an article responding to that study called, "If You're Asking American Jews If They're Religious, You Don't Understand American Jews." The last thing I want to note is that Judaism Unbound listeners can get 30% off Rachel Gross's new book, which again is called Beyond the Synagogue, Jewish Nostalgia as Religious Practice, by heading to the nyupress.org website, buying the book, and putting in the promo code Gross30-FM. That's GROSS30-FM. I have no idea what that stands for, but it will get you 30% off. You can also buy the book anywhere else that books are sold. So without further ado, Rachel Gross, welcome back to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
It's so great to be back. Thanks for having me.
So I wanted to start with a question that I feel like Lex and I were debating for a while a couple of years ago, and then we kind of stopped debating it, and I think we should be debating it again, which is basically, what does religion mean? What do we mean when we're talking about religion? Because the subtitle of your book is Jewish Nostalgia as Religious Practice, and I think it's really important to start by understanding, what do you mean when you say religion or religious practice?
I think of religion as really important relationships. So those relationships can be relationships between humans and the divine or other sacred figures, between living humans in community with one another, or between humans and their ancestors. So all kinds of meaningful relationships. And then the practices, the texts, the stories that we use to build those relationships. And in coming to this definition, I'm building on many other scholars of religious studies, and particularly religious studies scholar Robert Orsi, who thinks about religion as relationships. And I'm building on that to think about these three types of relationships. I think for Jews, we might think about how some Jews might be interested in a relationship with God. For other Jews, the relationship with God might really be in the background, and we might be thinking about relationships with the people around us or with our ancestors. And I think that those types of relationships are as important, that we can understand religion as those relationships too.
I guess I'm really just struggling with this question of like, okay, but in the common use, I mean, people say, well, I'm Jewish, but I'm not religious. They mean some version of like, I'm not into the God stuff or the praying. And we could redefine, I mean, this is what I was really struggling with as I was reading your book. It's like, we could redefine religion so that, everybody's religious now and it's okay. Why is it better to redefine the term religion than to just find a different word to capture this loyalty, this interest in Judaism, Jewishness that Jews have, but also being able to distinguish it between what the people who go to synagogue on Shabbat and pray for 3 hours, what they're doing?
So the question is, why does defining religion matter? And why does redefining it matter? And I think we can think about religion, definitions of religion mattering in a couple of different ways. First of all, it matters in a legal sense. Things that get defined as religion in the United States and in other places have certain types of protections. It really legally matters. I don't think that the stuff that I'm looking at is going to be legally protected in some way, but it is worth thinking about the stakes, I think, and keeping that in the background. Number two, especially for American Jews distribute large sums of money. And in doing so, they are often guided by definitions of religion, actually. So if we think about the large national studies of American Jews, the most recent one was the 2013 Pew study of American Jews, which I'm sure you've talked about on this podcast before.
Yeah. This episode was recorded before Pew 2020. The new Pew study came out, and we'll be talking about that in the future.
So that one really explicitly divided Jews into Jews by religion and Jews of no religion. And the way that large sums of money from Jewish philanthropists are being distributed is to target Jews of no religion and to get them to be more like Jews by religion. So it matters in terms of how money is distributed. I think finally, it matters in terms of how we think about our own practices. For me, ultimately, I just gave you a really long definition of what religion is. For me, religion is a really useful word for understanding what really matters. Right. And I think that's at play in Pew's use of the word as well. Labeling things as religion is a signal that they matter. I think culture matters. I think probably many of your listeners think that culture matters. But to label things that we typically understand as culture as religious both says that they matter and asks, how do they matter? In what ways do they matter?
I use a funny phrase to describe myself sometimes. Depending on the day, I answer like, what kind of Jew are you? Or what kind of religion do you practice? Whatever those kinds of questions are, I answer them differently depending on the day. Some days, I end up saying a very bizarre phrase, which is, I am a Machmir cultural Jew, which doesn't make sense to almost anyone. Machmir is a Hebrew word that basically means stringent or like, I don't know, very observant. And cultural Jew is a phrase that is used a lot of the time in different ways, but often to signify not a Jew in the God sense, like a Jew who cares about Jewish peoplehood, connects to Jewish history. And I occasionally describe myself that way. Now, that doesn't actually capture everything that I am, but I use it sometimes because I want to convey to people that the culture stuff really is of a level of importance to me that I want to call it religious, or I want you to hear it as like really important to me. And so I sometimes will do that because I think it surprises people and it gets them to think about that in a new way. Now, what I struggle with is that I think some people hear cultural Jew mostly as a knot. Like, I'm not a Jew of the other kind, of the religious kind, which I am, is the funny thing. And I think people struggle with, what does that actually mean? And what I loved in your book is that you provide a framework that I think answers that question better than anybody else has, which is you provide, and I'm not just saying that to be kind to you, like I've said this to others, like nostalgia is how you begin to talk about an American Jewish religious practice that is, I don't know, I don't want to say it's separate from the God pieces. I don't want to say that it's totally separate, but at the very least, it's like a positive approach to what one is doing Jewishly that is not God, but lands on people as something that isn't, oh, I don't do that other Judaism. So I'd love to hear more from you in your own voice. Like, how do you understand nostalgia and what are American Jews doing nowadays or in the recent past in terms of nostalgic Judaism?
I think of nostalgia as a sentimental longing for an irrevocable past, which is a definition that always makes me laugh because the historian's fundamental understanding of the past is that it is irrevocable. Like, the past is gone. That's fundamentally how time works. But nostalgia works by making us long for it. We have a relationship with the past. We are both sad that it's gone and also often a little relieved that we can't go back, right? It's a complicated longing for the past. So I think of the nostalgic practices that I looked at for this book: Jewish genealogy, Jewish genealogists, really, the use of historic synagogues as museums, children's books and dolls, and different kinds of Jewish foodways. And I think that they're all expressing through different ways in different institutions. They're expressing a longing for a particular moment, a particular defining moment in American Jewish history. For the moment of immigration of Central and Eastern European Jews to the United States from the 1880s to 1924. So we can roughly say around the turn of the 20th century. And this is a really defining moment in American Jewish history because it's when the vast majority of American Jews' ancestors come to the United States. As your listeners know well, not all American Jews have this story, but by far the majority of American Jews do have this story. And I think it really gets told as the defining story of American Jews. And it gets told in a lot of different formal and informal ways. And American Jews are really taught to feel a longing for this particular moment. It becomes a narrative that is so as important as any other kind of Jewish narrative. That emotion towards this particular moment in the past is so important in American Jews' lives that we can understand it as religion. What I love that you're picking up about my book, which most people do not pick up in this way, is that I'm not looking just at the people that we often understand as cultural Jews, as the cultural but not religious Jews. I'm looking at a wide variety of American Jews. the nostalgic practices that I'm looking at are practiced by Jews of every and no denominational affiliation, that they are across the board in terms of practice, in terms of belief. This nostalgic impulse, this way that American Jews are taught to feel about American Jewish history, is something that really happens across the board. It doesn't happen to every American Jew, but it is a major story that American Jews across the board are taught to feel longing for. So you can be, and I look at it in the book, I studied and interviewed people who are Orthodox Jews and engage this history, folks who are Reform Jews, and folks who would not affiliate with any denomination. So I love that you're picking that up within the book, that it's not just about an alternative to traditional religions, but that it can really complement traditional Jewish religious practices.
I'm lingering on this question of like, is it a good thing? You know, in other words, it might be something that is, okay, I can accept that. But as somebody who's not that attracted to a lot of the religious practice of Judaism and finds that wanting, I'm not sure that I feel that like replacing it with a nostalgic practice is something that would fill the hole that I have in my heart.
What I'm doing in this book is laying out the case for how big and how widespread this thing is, right? I think it's easier to see nostalgia as harmful. It's a simplifying narrative, by necessity, reductionist and simplifying. I look at the ways that nostalgia can be, I kind of overemphasize as a response to this, I overemphasize the ways that nostalgia is really productive. It's not just reductive, it's also productive. It produces Jewish community in certain ways. So we can talk about the ways in which it's harmful as well. I think that's really important. I think it's a complicated thing. But firstly, I see my job as laying it out. And then folks like you can come along and debate whether this is good or bad, right? Some of the examples, for instance, in the 1960s and 1970s, Americans started thinking a little bit differently about their ancestries. African Americans started to try to investigate their family stories in new ways. And that's a particularly difficult thing for African Americans, of course, because of the history and the legacy of slavery. So we get what's called the Roots movement. There was Alex Haley's famous book, Roots, and the various miniseries that have been produced based on that book. And folks we sometimes call white ethnics in a really awkward term. Folks like Ashkenazi Jews, Jews of Central and Eastern European descent, Italians, Irish, folks like that, started looking around. And by the 1960s and 1970s, they were in generally a more comfortable socioeconomic place than their immigrant ancestors had been in the early 20th century. And they started looking around. They said, oh, all of a sudden we're being identified not by our national origins or in the case of Jews, by our religion. We're just being labeled white people. And they started to think about, well, we're not so comfortable with that. And one way to deal with a little bit of the discomfort of being labeled as a kind of undifferentiated white was to turn to their family histories and really learn from African Americans who were starting to do genealogy work. So Jews, along with other folks, started doing Jewish genealogy in the 1970s. And it's really become a much bigger movement since then. So I'm interested in the ways that people tell their family stories and research their family stories, and the ways that they come together in physical groups, in Jewish genealogical societies, and in networks like Facebook groups, and the ways that they teach each other to do this research, and also the ways that they teach each other to feel about their family stories. That's both the nostalgia and the religion right there, right? That you're investigating your family history, you're learning how to feel about it, and you're placing it in a broader narrative. It's not just you and your family on your own, but many, many people investigate their family histories and want to tell a bigger story, want to find their place in history. Really, I think that's what genealogy is. And then we go back to my definition of religion as religion is what really matters. Religion is what answers the big questions in our lives. And I think that doing a quick search on ancestry.com can point you, can gesture to those big existential answers.
This piece about religion being what matters, I want to keep sitting with that because, I mean, and Dan and I have spoken about this, like reviving those years and years of debates, which I do love. I want to imagine a made-up Jew for a second. Nameless Jew.
Schmex Schmofberg.
Yes. Well, it's actually not about me. But so we have a Jew. They live their life and, you know, it's not that they spend their days agonizing, but they kind of feel like they're not Jewish enough. And, you know, they go to shul every Saturday morning and they study Talmud and stuff, but they feel like, given all the pressures of the Jewish community to watch Seinfeld and Transparent and Prince of Egypt, that they're, at the end of the day, sort of seen by others as not quite doing it right, as not being authentic enough. Because in this hypothetical world that doesn't exist, the ways that we measure Jewish authenticity and Jewish worth and Jewish commitment are through the amount of Seinfeld and Transparent and Prince of Egypt and Rugrats Hanukkah that you've watched, and not based on Saturday morning services. And the reason why now I'll break the story. I bring that up because that obviously doesn't exist. That person does not exist. Like, I don't think there's anybody out there who feels that they are being judged or like pushed aside from Jewish life because they go to services a lot, but they're not doing cultural Jewish things. It's not that I want people to exist that feel guilty. Like, I don't want that. But what we do have is a huge number of people who feel the opposite thing, which is they actually do have a set of Jewish commitments to a wide variety of things. They just haven't been told that they're allowed to call those things Jewish commitments. And so where I see your book coming in is, the Jewish genealogy stuff that I spend hours on. The deli that I go to that I've never thought of as a religious practice. I just go there and I order the bagel, like I order whatever it is. Like, that is a real thing. This book is sort of validating that. It's not that your book is a religious practice, but it's a scholarly book, but like people, I think, could read it and experience it that way. So I guess I'd love to hear from you more about that potential work that's being done here, even as I acknowledge that, like, I don't want to say your goal as a scholar was to like plant the seeds of Jewish validity in people. But if somebody were to take it that way, how would you feel?
I love that. I think about this. This is a scholarly book, as you say. And my first job with this book is, I'm going to be real honest. My first job in this book is to write this book and help me to keep my job. The writing this book was the thing I needed to keep my job as a professor. Number two was to engage in religious studies and Jewish studies academic debates. And number three, to talk to Jewish audiences like the one you described. And, I would love it if somebody read this book and said that that recognized the things that they were doing in their lives that were meaningful to them. Really, I think about that. That's what I would like readers, non-academic Jewish readers, to take away from this book, is to ask themselves, what am I doing in my life that is meaningful to me? And it can be things like, if it's going to synagogue, that's great. But I think alongside that, there are probably everyday things that are meaningful to you. The type of food you eat, or the books you read, or the shows you consume, as you described so beautifully, Lex, that I think those are things that we might dismiss, that we might not think about. And I actually think it's the everyday things in our lives that provide structure and substance to our lives, that stuff is super important. When I read, I think about two types of scholarship. I don't think it's about the intention of the writer, but about the perspective of the reader. For me, when I read, there's some works that are shocking, right? They can be in a good way or a bad way, but it's something new. It's something I've never thought about. It's a brand new idea for me. And that's great. And then there are some works that I read that just kind of shift things for me, where I say, oh, that material seems familiar to me, but it wasn't articulated in quite that way before. And I really, honestly, I want my work to be the latter. I don't need my work to be a brand new idea for folks, but if it makes somebody think just a little bit differently about the ways they form meaning in their lives, That's my goal. They don't have to agree with my definition of religion. I would love it if they did. But if it makes them think a little bit differently about their lives, wow.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about the other bookend of the case studies that you have, because that's where I really felt kind of validated. Although I have to say that I'm still kind of sitting with it and trying to figure out, what does it all mean at the end, which was the Jewish deli. There's this Jewish deli in Chicago, and it's like Jewish deli because it's not a kosher deli. It's actually not kosher. But it's very Jewish in the sense that it's all the words they're using are schmear and, this and that, fres and all that Yiddish words that mean stuff. And, there's this thing on the wall where it's like, it's in Hebrew letters, but if you look at it through the mirror, then you see it's actually in English letters backwards, but they look like Hebrew. And it's just this whole thing about feeling like you're in a Jewish place, but it's not religious, even it's not kosher, right? And I love this place. And in reading your book, I had this momentary feeling like, oh, maybe that's my synagogue. Like maybe I'm actually doing something kind of religious. I would love it if you could talk a little bit about your sense of what's going on there. Not just for me, Shmam Liebenson, but my case study. No, but just in general, what you think is going on for American Jews.
Yeah, I think delis are super religious places in my understanding of religion. I love your story about, I've never seen that with the letters that look like they could be Hebrew, but are actually English letters in the mirror. I love that. What a delight. And it's so kitschy, which is a word that I think is worth thinking about, right? I think about kitsch and I think about camp. Kitsch is stuff that is sickeningly sweet. Often that we might dismiss as overly sentimental. Camp is the stuff that is in on the joke. Restaurateurs that I'm looking at in this book are in on the joke. So most of them are not old school delis, though I think those are worth thinking about. I think delis in general are absolutely sites of community, sites where Jews find a deep meaning that for many Jews, when maybe Schmeberson sits down and has a pastrami sandwich, he might think about all the times that he's had a pastrami sandwich and about his family and about the broader history of how this deli food got to us. They're a very American Jewish kind of site. And they place many American Jews, I think, can use them as places to think about broader community. I would start from the place of delis being a religious site with this kind of broad definition of religion that I have.
As you were talking, it occurred to me that I haven't been in this deli that I love in over a year. And it's like, for the first time, I have this like deep, empathetic response to all my friends who have been lamenting on Facebook all year that they haven't set foot in their synagogue for a year. And that hasn't really bothered me. But now that I think about it, I actually have been denied my synagogue. So that's something. But I was also thinking about how there are some Jews who go to regular synagogues for what we might have before this conversation called religious reasons, meaning that they believe that they're required by God to come to synagogue or that they're somehow communing with God. Probably the majority of Jews that are at synagogue on a given Shabbat are not there for that reason. They're there for some other reason that we might well call nostalgia. And I would love to hear your thoughts about that. I mean, whether maybe nostalgia is actually the reason why most Jews participate in what are called religious activities. And that the other thing that's really on my mind, though, is something that Lex and I were talking about a few months ago, which had to do with Star Wars. And I, as somebody who grew up when Star Wars, the first one, when that first one came out, that was the definitional Star Wars for me. And then there were 3 movies, and then there was no Star Wars for a while. And so Star Wars kind of, I think for those of us who grew up with the original Star Wars, moved into the realm of nostalgia. Whereas for Lex, who came of age substantially later, and a whole new set of Star Wars movies came out, and then ever since, there have been all kinds of other Star Wars things. And now there's TV shows like The Mandalorian and everything. Like Star Wars, I think for Lex, is more alive than it is for me. What troubles me about nostalgia is that is it not the case that nostalgia is most powerful when the thing itself is not really alive? And that what is really troubling if we see that nostalgia is the watchword for how Jews relate to Judaism, that means something kind of negative about Judaism, that it's not really living. Because if it was living, then we would anchor our Judaism on some great thing that was invented yesterday.
I love your point or your question that nostalgia seems to be about, it's certainly about longing for things that are past, right? But I think that the longing itself is active. For me, that matters. And I can illustrate this with a story from my research. One of the synagogues that I studied is the Vilna Shul in Boston. Vilna is a city in Lithuania. Now it's been in many different countries. It's now Vilnius, Lithuania, and shul is the Yiddish word for synagogue. So Vilna Shul means that the original immigrants who founded this synagogue, most of them came from the region around what's now Vilnius, Lithuania. So this synagogue was vibrant in the early 20th century. Jews moved out of Boston proper over the course of the 20th century as they moved out of cities and into the suburbs. And over the years, this congregation dwindled until it had 3 members. And in the 1980s, the last president of the synagogue, one of these 3 Jews, was mugged while setting up for services. And he was like, this is it. I'm done. I'm throwing in the towel. He was going to sell the building. It was actually in prime real estate in Boston and on Beacon Hill. And he was going to donate the proceeds to charities. It turns out that a Boston law about dissolving institutions like synagogues meant that the proceeds from the synagogue would actually go to another Orthodox synagogue in Boston. So there was a huge community fight, as you can imagine, about whether this synagogue should be dissolved and the other Orthodox synagogue in Boston would benefit from it, or preservationists said, actually, don't sell it, keep it around, and we'll turn it into a community center and museum. Ultimately, the preservationists won. I see this very much as a religious fight about what should be done with this space. I think all of the sides are religious here. The ones who want to sell it and turn the money use the money for another synagogue, that's a religious one. And I think the preservationists, because I think about nostalgia and memory and community as religion, I think that they also have a religious argument. Now, CJP, Boston's federation, the big organization that controls a lot of Jewish philanthropic money in Boston, ultimately threw their weight behind the preservationists, which is part of why they won. And one of the things that persuaded them was not that they cared so much about this place being turned into a museum, but that along the way, a group of millennials started meeting in this synagogue, not regularly, just once a month. They started having synagogue services. That's all. So in some ways, this seems like it's less religious, right? So the Federation was interested in millennials doing religion. That's why they cared. I actually think that they wanted less religion, less traditional religion in some way. They didn't want an active congregation. They wanted it to be a museum that was sometimes used by millennials for synagogue purposes, right? So this is a very complicated story, but ultimately, the millennials were interested in having services there for their group. They call Havurah on the Hill because it was a place of history. That's why it was interesting to them. That for all of these different stakeholders who ultimately were interested in turning this place into a museum, the longing for the past is an active force. So I don't think it's just about turning this place into a dead museum. It's about a longing for an active place. And this builds on many, many scholarly debates about what museums are. We might think of museums as places for things that are dead and gone, but folks who work at museums And scholars who study museums would tell you, actually, they're places where things happen. Community happens at museums. Thinking about the past or thinking about whatever the subject is happens at museums. It just happens in a different way. So I think turning a synagogue into a museum isn't just a dead Judaism, but actually a different kind of living Judaism.
First off, shout to some episodes we had way back when with some wonderful Jewish museum professionals. You laid the groundwork. In the show notes, we will feature some of these episodes. So folks who want to think more about Jewish museums, about museums in general, go to those. Okay. That also leads into a question I sit with all the time. So I lead a lot of, workshops and conversations, etc., about digital Judaism, for lack of a better phrase. And I often begin those conversations, or close, depends, with some form of where is Judaism? Where does Judaism live? I ask those questions literally a lot. And what's interesting is people actually intuit a lot of the time some of the kinds of thesis statements that you bring in your book in very polished language. People intuit that the Deli or they don't bring up Jewish museums usually, but they intuit that the answers are not just the synagogue. I've felt Jewish in X, Y, or Z place. And coming back to the deli piece, because I'm flashing back to my own Jewish but not kosher deli, which there's one in Milwaukee. It was 3/4 of a mile from my house. So it's all the layers of Jewish nostalgia plus my neighborhood nostalgia for Shorewood, Wisconsin, which is not what it once was in all of the ways that neighborhoods change. But I remember it was my ritual. I didn't call it a ritual, but I would go with my parents to Benji's, the Jewish deli in Shorewood, which, like many Jewish delis, was owned and founded by Jews for a long time. It's actually not owned by a Jew anymore, but it's owned by, as far as I can tell, a really lovely person who cares a lot about having the Jewish cultural vibes there. But so I would go there and I would eat a hot dog, usually a hot dog, and then I would go next door to Baskin Robbins, which was literally next door, and I would eat ice cream. So literally my ritual was eat unkosher. It was eat a hot dog followed by ice cream, which, breaks meat and dairy rules. By the way, I would go to Baskin Robbins, which was founded by two Jews who met, I think, somehow through their shared membership in ZBT, in a Jewish fraternity. So all that's to say, on its face, different approaches to the what is religion question lead to very different answers about whether what I was doing was a Jewish action. From my personal experience, it certainly was.
So I love that story. And I think one of the many things it points to is the role of non-Jews in Jewish nostalgia, and I think more broadly in Jewish institutions, both as participants, but also as entrepreneurs and creators. They might work at Jewish institutions like museums. They might own Jewish delis. They might be, to talk about a case study of mine that we haven't talked about much already, they might be illustrators or even authors of Jewish children's books. And authors that I talked to in my study, I think really articulated this best, that I talked to Eric Himmel. Your listeners might know him best from Herschel and the Hanukkah Goblins. Real classic. If you don't know that book, go read it immediately.
In the show notes too. Happy to shout it out.
Amazing. So I talked to him particularly about his book, When Mindy Saved Hanukkah, which takes place at the Eldridge Street Synagogue, which is a synagogue I looked at on the Lower East Side. And he worked with a non-Jewish illustrator for this book, and she had to learn a lot about what synagogues looked like and what different types of Jewish history looked like. And Eric Himmel said, you know what? I think of myself in the tradition of many, many Jewish congregations throughout the world who have relied on on non-Jewish architects and non-Jewish artisans to build their holy spaces. We can also think about the ways that non-Jews participate in Jewish nostalgia. And I think this gets to the ways that non-Jews participate in our Jewish communities more broadly. So one example that I look at in the book, the Eldridge Street Synagogue on the Lower East Side, a couple who met there two museum staffers, both women who met while working at the museum at Eldridge Street, fell in love and got married. And one is Jewish and one is not Jewish. They decided that they really wanted the museum at Eldridge Street to be part of their wedding in some way, because it was such an important part of their story as a couple. But the museum at Eldridge Street shares its space with an Orthodox congregation that has met there continuously since the 1880s. And this couple of museum staffers knew that they didn't want to rock the boat. They didn't want to ask if they could get married there at a time when the Orthodox congregation owns the space. It shifts between who is in charge, which organization is in charge of the space. And they didn't want to jeopardize the museum's relationship with this Orthodox congregation, both because they were two women marrying each other and because they were a Jew and a non-Jew getting married. So they got married at a dim sum place down the street on a Saturday evening. And then they held their ketubah signing, their marriage contract signing, on a Sunday morning when the museum owns the space. And they were able to invite all their friends and family. And I think that this story, I love this story of this couple because it points to the ways that non-Jews are directing Jewish institutions. And I think being a staff member at a place like the museum at Eldridge Street means directing Jews' emotions. And I would say Jewish religious emotions, right? Jewish experiences of this space. And it also points to, I think, the possibilities and the limits of non-Jewish participation, both in Jewish nostalgia and in Jewish religion and communities more broadly.
That's a really cool connection. I mean, it's funny. I was mentioning the non-Jewish owner of Benji's, not thinking it was just, mentioning it in passing. But when I hear guests on the show, so often what happens in passing ends up being the best part. So thank you for catching that and running with it. Now that we're there, I'm always trying to create lineages of, and I don't mean that genealogically. I mean just sort of images in our mind to trace different kinds of Jews today back so that we don't think that everybody who's operating today is just new and doing something unprecedented. So I've talked about tracing a lineage back to Korah, who's this rebel in the Torah and who I think is seen in many ways as a negative figure, but I actually want to claim in positive ways. I've talked about that on the podcast before, but now I'm thinking with the folks that you mentioned who are not Jewish, but are holding a key role advising Jewish institutions, directing Jewish institutions, I want to make a lineage of Jethro. We look at the book of Exodus, and there's all sorts of stuff happening. It's jam-packed, so it's understandable that we skirt over certain parts. But the book of Exodus happens, you leave Egypt, and midway through the book, there's a section of the Torah that's called Jethro. And it's this really interesting moment where Jethro, who's not Jewish, who's a Midianite priest, he's like the Midianite high priest, he plays a role in directing, not a Jewish institution, that's not really the right way to describe Moses, but he gives a key piece of advice to Moses in setting up Israelite society, which you could think of as similar to Jewish institutions. And that really, Moses follows that, and it makes a big difference in the future of the story. And I think somehow, even as that's the case, we look at that and we're like, oh, what an interesting sidebar, what an interesting exception that there's this non-Jew who plays a role in the Israelite Exodus. But I don't think it's an exception. I think we have this over and over and over again. And I haven't made the lineage yet, so I can't yet give you the rapid fire, but maybe soon we'll do that. But we can look in all sorts of eras and we could do that work so that when we look at that non-Jewish owner of a deli, we don't think wow, what an incredible thing. It's incredible. I do want to treat these people as incredible and wonderful, but I don't want to treat them as exceptional, because then we just sort of re-enshrine the understandings of Judaism where we think it's all directed by the insiders, by the Jews, etc. But I'm curious if there's ways in which what I'm saying about how we remember the past on this particular front tie to your broader ideas about how we're relating to the past with nostalgia.
I think that's terrific. And I might add in Sipporah also, Moses's wife. who is generally not understood as Jewish. And I think also I would add to this that we can think about non-Jews as directing and shaping Jewish nostalgia, but they also participate in it. That plenty of non-Jews, probably more non-Jews, eat at Jewish delis than Jews do.
Yeah, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but I want to, on the Tzipora piece, I really want to hold that, and I want to name that even in the biblical text itself, Tzipora is the one to actually ritually circumcise her and Moses' son. Like, she takes a religious role in Jewish life directly in a sort of undeniable way that I think is important. Sorry, back to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe less in the Brit Milah and the circumcision story, but I think of her going along with Moses and going along with the Israelites and participating. And you can tell me if you like this analogy, but I might think of her like the non-Jewish deli patrons who are hanging out with Jews. And I think of delis much more so than synagogues. I think synagogues can be a place where we show non-Jews what Judaism looks like. And there's actually a long history of non-Jews going on, like basically tourist visits to synagogues. There's a very long history of that. But delis can be a place where anybody can participate. Anybody can go into a deli. That's the point, right? That's what deli owners want. They want to make a living. They want to have as many customers as possible. But along the way, non-Jews get to, I think, get a taste. Get a taste of American Jewish culture. And maybe as customers, they shape it as well. So I might think about that as Tzipora's legacy in some way.
Well, there's definitely something there that I'd like to return to at a future point, which is like, if you were to be successful at making Judaism appealing to Jews, then it would inevitably also be appealing to a lot of non-Jews, because the truth is that Jews aren't that different from non-Jews. And when you see something Jewish that's not that appealing to non-Jews, it's probably not that appealing to Jews either, you know? And so the piece that I wanted to ask you about that had to do with non-Jews was a little bit different, which is like, are Jews exceptional in your read in having this amount of nostalgia, as you put it? Or is nostalgia, the way you're defining it, just part of human existence, and everybody is like that, and so therefore we're looking at the Jewish variant of that here? Or do you think there's something inherent in Judaism as we've received it that makes Jews especially prone to nostalgia?
I do not think of Jews as exceptional. I think Jews are fascinating. I am so privileged to get to spend my life studying them. I think they're super interesting, but I think about Jews, as I think you guys do, as being influenced and part of the cultures that they are surrounded by. So I think that just as I told the story of Jewish genealogists being part of a broader trend of interest in family history, those genealogists were inspired by non-Jewish Americans looking for their family histories, and then had to figure out, what does it mean to do Ashkenazi Jewish history? And it requires certain skills. It requires knowledge of certain political geographies. It requires language skills. It requires knowledge of Jewish marriages and Jewish documents, right? So it requires certain skills to do that, but it's part of a broader trend. The Jewish restaurateurs that I look at in this book very much built on the work of Asian American chefs and Italian American chefs. Asian American chefs did things like say, hey, authentic Chinese food in the United States isn't just Chinese food that looks the way it's served in China, but actually there's a really unique tradition of American Chinese food. And we might refine that and elevate that and play with it in different ways. But there is an authentic American tradition. I actually hate the word authenticity for other reasons. But there is what we might call an authentic Chinese American cuisine. So Jewish American entrepreneurs were building on this. So no, I don't think of Jews as exceptional, but I think of them as doing something particular. we might be in, or we might have had a really nostalgic moment, especially the early 2000s were the moment of the hipster who was really interested in all things nostalgic. And I think especially the food entrepreneurs that I am looking at are really coming out of this moment. So they're really, all of the Jews that I'm looking at are influenced by broader trends and doing something particular and Jewish with it. When they do something particular and Jewish with it, they institutionalize it in particular ways and teach other Jews how to relate to these materials and how to feel this way about American Jewish history in a particular way.
Okay, so there's so many things that you look at in your book, so many case studies. And I've got a closing question. I mean, we're running out of time, and this closing question may not feel totally like a closing question. So I apologize to you, and I apologize to listeners if this feels like we're ending on a cliffhanger, but that's only because there's just so much good stuff in Beyond the Synagogue. But here we go. I have one more question, which is, you've written in your book a little bit about PJ Library, which is a really important project in which we've talked about previously on the show with two wonderful guests, Sophia Pasternak and Amy Lucido. We've talked about how book publishers generally, not just PJ Library, but like actually have a huge amount of communal power. And I made the claim that it's power not just over like Jewish culture, just to flash back to what we were saying before, but like actually, for lack of a better phrase, like Judaism, because I do believe that how we read things with kids is part of the bigger picture. It's not just like a sidebar exercise. So on that PJ Library front, like what might we consider with respect to Jewish children's literature, whether it's that organization in particular or more broadly? Like, what did you glean from looking at them through the lens of nostalgia and non-traditional understandings of religion?
Yeah, so I believe I am still the only scholar to have published about PJ Library. And if you want, you can link to the edited volume in which I've written that piece.
Done deal.
In a separate piece, I argue that PJ Library is doing religious work. And I think that PJ Library is probably the most important Jewish organization out there right now, that they are shaping Jewish families and shaping what American Judaism looks like and really Judaism worldwide, that they aim to get at families at their most vulnerable, which sounds creepy, but I think they do so intentionally, and I don't mean it in a creepy way, that they offer parents books to read, especially at bedtime. They're called PJ Library, PJ for pajama, and they offer parents a book to read at bedtime, which I'm not a parent. I hear from parents of young children that bedtime is when you are most exhausted and you are so tired. And wouldn't it be great if you could just grab something that you know would be meaningful for you and your family? And I think that they offer through their books, and more so even through their various organizational efforts, they offer families a way into organized Jewish religion. I think they're religious both in the kind of broad way that I think about religion, that we might think about bedtime as a religious ritual in all kinds of ways. But the PJ Library books that I look at in my book are stories of Eastern and Central European Jewish immigration. So if that's the story that you're reading at bedtime, you can help your child, regardless of your family's history, place themselves and place your family within a broader story, right? So you're doing religion in that kind of broad way that I understand it. But from what I've understood through interviews with staff members, PJ Library is also interested in getting families who are not affiliated with traditional Jewish religious institutions and gradually pulling them a little bit closer towards institutional Jewish religion. So if you are, for instance, a family who maybe gets signed up by a grandparent or a friend for PJ Library, you start getting those books, PJ Library might encourage you, your local PJ Library representative might encourage you to join a group of families who also get PJ Library books in your neighborhood. And I know my sister has a young child, and I know she's looking for friends who have kids the age of her kid. That's a service that they're offering in some cases. And then your group of friends through PJ with the help of that PJ library representative might think, you know what? We're all going to send our kids to Jewish preschool, and then they've got you, right? They're explicitly trying to draw families towards that Jew by religion in Pew's definition. So I think they're operating as religious in a whole bunch of ways, and I think they are so fascinating. And we know from their own sociological studies that they're doing that they're really making a difference in families' lives in ways we can measure and ways we can describe really concretely.
Thank you so much. Wow, we've covered a lot of ground today. Please, folks, use that 30% off link. Get yourselves a copy of Beyond the Synagogue. Thank you so much, Rachel Gross, for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you so much for having me, Lex and Dan. It has been a pleasure.
And thank you so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. 2 quick reminders before we let you know all the different ways you can be in touch with us. First, you can get Beyond the Synagogue, this awesome book by Rachel Gross, with a 30% off discount if you purchase it through the NYU Press website. Just go there, find Beyond the Synagogue, purchase it, and when you exit, just make sure you put in the code GROSS30-FM. And you'll get 30% off. We highly encourage that. And we also highly encourage, just like Dan mentioned at the top of the episode, that you support us, Judaism Unbound. And you can do that via judaismunbound.com/donate. Even if it's $1 this time of year, especially as the fiscal year comes to a close, it makes a great deal of difference to us to have your support. So thank you. And here are all the ways you can be in touch with us. First, there are our Facebook pages, Twitter pages, Instagram pages, pages on pages. All of those are at Judaism Unbound on those different applications. You can head to our website, judaismunbound.com, and you can email us at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. And our final words to mention are that we are greatly appreciative for the support for this episode that comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. Thank you so much, and with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.